We have covered every position group on the offense in this series so far, so now it's time to move on to the defensive side of the ball. This video is going to be going over the Browns' interior defensive line, defensive tackles, however you want to say it. Last year, I made this video as one big thing of the entire defensive line, but looking at the official roster right now, that would probably take way too long for my usual runtime. So this one's going to just address the interior defensive line, which last season was just terrible. I wish I had some more nuanced discussion about it, but it was pretty awful, and that was exemplified by the just horrific run defense that plagued the Browns last year, and not just against teams that are usually known for having good run games. The LA Chargers ran all over this team, and the Chargers are really just kind of letting Justin Herbert and the receiver group do their thing, but Austin Eckler had I think over 200 yards in the game against the Browns. It was an apparent issue, and so the interior defensive line definitely needed to be addressed, and it was with the addition of Dalvin Tomlinson. The Browns, you could argue it is the biggest free agent splash that they got. Definitely, undoubtedly the biggest in terms of pure measurements. 6'3", 325 pounds. He's a huge dude. Signed a 4-year contract with Cleveland with some shenanigans with the signing bonuses and roster options like there always is with these Andrew Berry contracts. He's putting that Harvard degree to good work. His current cap hit for this season is about $4.3 million. I think it's actually a smidge less than that. And the team does have some flexibility if he turns out that it doesn't work out at all with Cleveland. They could move on from his contract after 2 years. Now that would carry a lot of dead cap if they chose to do so, but I guess if Dalvin Tomlinson just is a non-option after 2 seasons, they could let him go. But the hope and probably the safer bet is that he will be good enough so that the Browns won't even think about using that option in the next 2 seasons. Now, they did get him to obviously be a threat in terms of stopping the run, but he does have some pass rush numbers as well. 2.5 sacks last season, 10 quarterback hits, as well as 42 combined tackles. And the interior defensive line, they definitely needed an impact guy. They needed somebody who could provide a splash, and I think that's what they got in Dalvin Tomlinson. Now, he is for sure the headliner of the defensive tackle room, but the question is who's going to play alongside him in the new Jim Schwartz defense. One of the candidates is Siaki Ika, the 3rd-round pick out of Baylor out of this most recent draft. Another just physically huge guy. He's even bigger than Dalvin Tomlinson at 6'4", 358 pounds. He is the 2nd heaviest player on the roster behind DeJuan Jones. Dalvin Tomlinson is the 3rd heaviest player, so some big guys in the defensive tackles for the Browns. The added emphasis on size, I think it does play into the defensive system that is ran by Jim Schwartz with kind of a wide 9 kind of feel where the defensive ends are kind of, they're spread out more to the side, so the defensive tackles definitely need to be able to prevent those runs in between the tackles because the defensive ends aren't going to be, they're not going to be in as good of a position to stop those runs. So the defensive tackle do need to be responsible for those. And while he didn't have any sacks in his last season with Baylor, he did have 24 total tackles, 2 of them tackles for loss. Again, I'm not really concerned about the lack of sack numbers for these guys because the defensive tackle's room job is going to be to get those runs stopped. Now, he does have a pretty good opportunity to immediately start with the Browns unless some of the other players start to step up, guys like Perrion Winfrey. He is entering his 2nd season, a 4th-round pick out of Oklahoma. I think the organization did have some really high hopes for him last year. They really see him as a value pick who could have made an immediate impact for the Browns, although he didn't really live up to those high expectations. He did play in 13 games, never started in a single game, had 342 total snaps on defense, 22 combined tackles, and half of a sack for him. Maybe what he needs is to not be the headliner because maybe with Dalvin Tomlinson with him, the offensive line won't be focused as much on him in the interior. He won't be expected to carry all the load of being the main threat in the inside of the defensive line, which I think was probably too much of an expectation for him as a 4th-round rookie out of Oklahoma to carry an interior defensive line group that was pretty lackluster, especially by NFL standards. But he didn't really help himself with some of the off-the-field stuff that he's gotten himself into. Early on last season, he violated team rules, and the team suspended him for a game, so that's not what you want to see, especially when character issues were kind of a contributor as to why he fell in the draft. And he was also arrested earlier in the offseason on misdemeanor assault charges that were eventually dropped. So I guess that won't have an impact on him moving forward, but it was a bit of a news distraction earlier on. So he will. I think he will have a chance to prove himself. I do think that this front office and this regime has been very, very hesitant to move on from their draft picks, but the team has brought in some really stiff competition for that spot alongside Tomlinson, so he will have to work. He'll have to grab that spot from somebody. And although I don't think it would be terrible for Perrion Winfrey if he was like maybe the first guy in the rotation, maybe if he isn't starting, but he's the first guy to come back on if Tomlinson or maybe a guy like Siaki Ika goes out. I don't think that would be a terrible role for Perrion Winfrey, but I do think it would be a little disappointing considering what some of the expectations were for him coming out of the draft last season. Then you move on to Jordan Elliot. He was actually one of the starters last season alongside Taven Bryan, which was, again, the defensive tackle room last season, really disappointing. Had 2 sacks, 5 total tackles for loss, and 36 combined tackles. He is entering his 4th season. This is going to be the last year of his rookie deal. Last season, he was okay. Again, he was one of the starters on, honestly, what I think was one of the worst defensive tackle groups in the NFL. So that's kind of like saying you're kind of like the nicest guy in prison there. I'm not saying it would be a complete disaster if he ends up being one of the starters, but I would be completely whelmed if he was the guy who they plopped next to Dalvin Tomlinson, because that means that nobody else in the room really stepped up. Both Ika and Winfrey kind of would have both not really done much in training camp and in preseason games. So if it does end up being Jordan Elliott starting, I think that would be a little bit disappointing for some of the younger guys. And honestly, Jordan Elliott wouldn't be bad as like the 3rd or 4th guy in a rotation, but if he's starting again, then I do think that means there's a bit of stagnation in the room besides the Tomlinson addition. Moving on to some of the more guys who I think are going to be more in the depth in the depth chart. Tommy Togiai, who hasn't really done much of anything so far in his early NFL career. Again, it is still pretty early, so I guess there is time for him to blossom still. The organization is going to be looking for any sort of spark for him in year 3. I know there are some plays where he has individual plays. Obviously, you could put together some highlights for him, but nothing with any sort of consistency. I am personally pulling for him as he is a former Ohio State guy, but it's really been slow going for him so far, and honestly, the Browns don't have that kind of time to wait there with their cap situation moving forward in future seasons and what they're trying to accomplish. I don't think that the Browns are going to wait around for him to improve and develop. Then you have Trysten Hill, signed in the offseason to a cheap 1-year deal. Most of his young career has been spent with the Dallas Cowboys. He's never really been a high snap count kind of guy, always been kind of in a rotation. If anything, he'll be deep in the depth chart, not getting too many snaps, but if somebody else gets hurt or they needs to get a couple guys some rest, he can be there. So if anything, maybe he gets there. I'm not even sure if he makes the final 53-man roster with this defensive tackle group. Then you have Maurice Hurst, who I think is a bit of a wild card of a signing. He's also on a cheap 1-year deal, signed in free agency this offseason, but his early career has been pretty riddled with injuries. He missed all of last season and only played 2 games with the 49ers in 2021, but he has shown potential that he can be an impact player. So if he's able to stay healthy and he's able to show that full potential in Cleveland, he actually could make this roster and I think have a pretty decent impact. I think he could climb as high as like being the 3rd or 4th guy on this depth chart if he's able to stay healthy and if he's able to fully cash in on his potential, which I think both of those are kind of pretty big ifs at the moment. But it's a low risk, high reward signing for the Browns, and I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on him in training camp. Then you have the final name on our list in Michael Dwumfour. He's been in the league a couple of years and has just essentially been bouncing around some practice squads, and that's what's most likely ended up happening here with Michael Dwumfour at the bottom of this depth chart. I'm not trying to disrespect him. I'm just saying that, and he can prove me wrong. Obviously, he can climb his way through the ranks, but as of right now, I feel like he probably is the most unlikely player to make the 53-man roster out of this whole interior defensive line group. But that's just how I see it. You can let me know in the comments how you feel about this defensive tackle room for the Browns down below. If you really have a strong feeling about it, if you feel like I'm really underselling some of these guys, or if I'm overhyping somebody, you can let me know. Thank you all for watching. If you made it this far into the video, I will see you at the next one.